you ever wanted to know what your favorite historical figure looked like in real life? What was their hair color? Their eye color? How tall were they? Was their portrait true to their person? While I'm sure you have wondered these things, I'm sure you've never considered going to their grave and digging them up to find out. Not only would they definitely not look the same, it's also gross and weird and illegal. But back then, especially in the Victorian times, they didn't care, and often there was no repercussions for digging up the dead. Catherine of Valois was born on October 27, 1401 in France to Charles VI, King of France, and his wife Isabeau of Bavaria. In 1420, at the age of 18, she married the 33-year-old King of England, Henry V, making her queen consort. In 1422, after only 2 years of marriage and 8 months after the birth of their only child, Henry V died, and their son ascended the throne of England as Henry VI. 6 years after the death of her husband, Catherine scandalously married Owen Tudor. They had 4 children together, including Edmund Tudor, the father of Henry VII. Catherine was subsequently, obviously, the grandmother of Henry VII and great-grandmother of Henry VIII. The cause of Catherine's death is disputed, but she died on January 3, 1437 at the age of 35. Catherine was buried in the Old Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, but her rest would only last for the next 65 years. During the reign of her grandson, Henry VII, the Lady Chapel was demolished to make renovations for the new Henry VII Chapel. Catherine's was one of the tombs demolished during this renovation, and her body was taken from her badly decayed coffin and placed into a wooden chest and placed on the floor next to her first husband, Henry V's tomb. Instead of reburying her, they decided to leave her there, and for the next 4 centuries, her body was used as a tourist attraction. In 1669, Samuel Pepys, famous for his published diary, visited the abbey for his 36th birthday. In his diary, he wrote, "On Shrove Tuesday, 1669, I to the abbey went, and by favor did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of the body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth. Reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen, and this my birthday, and I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen." In 1786, Richard Gow wrote that the scholars at Westminster Abbey had amused themselves with tearing Catherine's body to pieces, and by now it was just a shapeless mass. In 1788, her body was finally put into a secured vault, the Villers Vault, when Mary Villers, Countess of Buckingham's body, was interred in there. Almost 100 years later, during the reign of Queen Victoria, the whereabouts of Catherine's body was not for sure. It was thought that she might be in the Villers Vault, but nobody knew for sure, so Arthur Stanley, the Dean of Westminster Abbey, decided to find out. In 1877, Lord Henry Percy died, and he was interred into the Percy Vault, which just so happened to be right next to the Villers Vault. So Arthur Stanley attended the funeral, and after it was done, they broke the walls between separating the 2 vaults, and in the Villers Vault, there she was. There was Catherine. They found her. Most of her bones and teeth were missing, which were probably taken as souvenirs by the many people who were allowed to see her over the centuries. Catherine was given a brand new coffin, and she was buried in Henry V's chapel with a brand new tomb, and there she remains to this day, thankfully. Edward IV ascended the throne of England on March 4, 1461, after defeating the Lancastrian armies. His reign was plagued with war, but 2 years after his death, his daughter, Elizabeth of York, would marry the Lancastrian Henry VII after he defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, thus finally ending the Wars of the Roses. When Edward IV died on April 9, 1483, at the age of 40 from an unknown cause, he was buried at St. George's Chapel. 306 years later, in 1789, renovations began at St. George's Chapel under the instruction from George III. During the construction, Edward's tomb and vault were opened, and they obviously found Edward inside. His coffin was 7 feet long, and his skeleton was perfect. There was a dark liquid at the bottom of the coffin that covered his feet, which I guess was the embalming fluid, or maybe some bodily fluids. Whatever it was, they decided that they needed it in their lives, so they took some jars of it and took it home with them. I don't know why, I don't. On the inside of the vault, there were names, written on the wall, which I find it interesting. They made a sketch of the inside of the vault, where you can see the names there. It's kind of interesting. And then they took locks of Edward's hair, the huge. Oh, they also said that the liquid in the coffin tasted bitter. How did they know that? How did they test that? Margaret Tudor was born on November 28, 1489, as the second child and eldest daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Her siblings were that of Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry VIII, and Mary Tudor, Queen of France. On January 25, 1503, at the age of 13, she married the 29-year-old King of Scotland, James IV, making her queen consort. Their son would ascend the throne as James V, and after his death, their granddaughter would ascend to the throne as Mary, Queen of Scots. Margaret was much like her brother Henry when it came to love and marriages. After her first husband's death, she secretly married Archibald Douglas, the 6th Earl of Angus, and the two had a daughter together named Margaret Douglas. The marriage became strained with Archibald being unfaithful, and they were divorced in 1527. Margaret married again the next year to Henry Stuart, the 1st Lord of Methven. Years later, Margaret discovered that Henry was keeping a mistress, and she wanted a divorce. Margaret never got her divorce, unfortunately, and she died on October 18, 1541, at the age of 51, from what is believed to have been a stroke. Henry Stuart then married his mistress after Margaret's death. Margaret was buried at Perth Charter House in Scotland, which was destroyed by Protestant reformers in 1559. Margaret's remains were apparently taken from her tomb and burned, but according to Agnes Strickland, the author of The Lives of the Queens of England, she was taken to a St. John's Church, but there's no evidence for this, and the whereabouts of Margaret's remains are unknown to this day. Mary Tudor was born on March 18, 1496, as the youngest daughter and youngest surviving child of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Her siblings were Arthur, Prince of Wales, Margaret Tudor, and Henry VIII. On October 9, 1514, at the age of 18, she married the 52-year-old King of France, Louis XII. Louis died only 2 months after they married, and Henry VIII marries brother St. Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, to go back to France and retrieve her. However, Henry made Charles promise that he wouldn't propose to Mary, since their affection for each other was known. Mary persuaded Charles to break this promise, and the two were secretly married on March 3, 1515. Henry was obviously furious about this, but instead of Charles being executed, him and Mary were instead fined £24,000. They would have 4 children together, and Mary died on June 25, 1533 at the age of 37 from an unknown cause. She was buried at Bury St. Edmund's Abbey, but 5 years later she was moved to St. Mary's Church after the monastery was dissolved. In 1784, Mary was moved again, this time to a different part of the church, and while this happened, several people took locks of her hair, including Henry Walpole and Dorothy Bentinck, Duchess of Portland. Her hair was reported to be 2 feet long and red and gold in color, and some of the locks still exist today. Catherine Parr was the 6th and final wife of Henry VIII. During her reign as queen, she served as regent and became the first woman to publish an original work under her own name in English. 4 months after the death of Henry VIII, Catherine married again to Thomas Seymour, the uncle to her stepson, the new king Edward VI. Their marriage was a secret and was not received well when it was revealed. In March 1548, to Catherine's surprise, she became pregnant. She was 35 by this time and hadn't conceived from her other 3 marriages, so she probably didn't think that she would ever have children of her own. Unfortunately, Catherine would die only 6 days after giving birth to her daughter Mary. It was not uncommon during this time for women to die from postpartum infections. Catherine is buried in St. Mary's Chapel at Sudley Castle. During the English Civil War in the 17th century, Sudley Castle was ransacked and Catherine's tomb was destroyed. Her remains weren't rediscovered until 1768, and in 1782, Joseph Lucas, a member of the local gentry, decided to examine her grave. He ripped off the top of the coffin and was surprised to find Catherine's body in perfect condition. She was wrapped in 6 or 7 sheer cloths of linen. He cut the linen to reveal a part of her arm, which he described as white and moist. He made a sketch of her body, and in it you can see the part where he cut her arm on the cloth. Her coffin was dug up again in 1792 by a group of vandals, and when they reburied her, they buried her upside down. In 1817, Catherine was finally moved to a safer tomb where no one could disturb her. By this time, she was only bones, because her body had decayed so much from the amount of times that people had dug her up. I also forgot to mention that they measured her coffin, and it measured out 5 feet and 4 inches long. During the many times Catherine's coffin was opened, relics were taken from it, such as a piece of fabric from her gown, locks of her hair, and a tooth. I feel like if you're watching this video, then you probably know who Henry VIII is, and I don't really need to go over that, really. 6 wives, jousting accident, mentally abusing his children, another jousting accident. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, at the age of 55 to reign for 36 years. There are many theories for Henry's cause of death, but his health started going downhill after he suffered a jousting accident in 1536 that nearly killed him. Henry's body was interred into a vault at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, where his third wife, Jane Seymour, had been interred in almost 10 years before. This was supposed to be a temporary burial place for both of them, but it's where they both still remain to this day. Henry originally had big plans for his tomb, with plans for it originally beginning in 1518 when he was only 27 years old. The tomb was to be an edifice decorated with oriental stones, white marble pillars, gilded bronze angels, life-size images of Henry and Jane, and a statue of Henry on horseback. The tomb was not complete by the time Henry died, and his son, Edward VI, who succeeded after him, did some work on it but died before it could be finished. Henry's eldest daughter, Mary I, who succeeded after Edward, did no work on the tomb during her 5-year reign. Henry's youngest daughter, Elizabeth I, who succeeded after Mary, did some work on the tomb, but again, it was never finished. During the English Civil War in the 17th century, parts of Henry's incomplete tomb were sold off to raise funds. In 1649, Charles I was executed, and his body was interred into the same vault with Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. After Charles was buried, some curious bystanders took a look inside the vault and saw that Henry's coffin was severely damaged, almost as if it had been beaten. This could have happened from when they put Charles into the vault. Maybe his coffin damaged Henry's coffin, or maybe somebody just beat the shit out of it. Also, after Charles was buried, a foot soldier stole one of Henry's bones and apparently was planning to make a knife out of it, but they were like, no, and they took the bone back. In the 18th century, an infant son of Queen Anne's was at some point interred into the vault. The vault was opened again in 1813 by accident, and George VI, who was Prince of Wales at the time, said that they should examine Charles I's body to see if it was really him. It was him, and they determined this because his head was loose and they were able to take it, detach it from his body, and they also said that it was quite wet. Sir Henry Halford, one of the men who examined the vault, said that Henry's coffin measured at 6 feet and 10 inches long, and some beard still remained on his chin. Jane Seymour's coffin was in perfect condition and seemed to have never been touched. Several relics were taken from the vault during this opening, and in 1888 the vault was opened again to return them. During this, Alfred Young made a sketch of the inside of the vault. The coffin on the left is Charles I. The small coffin on the top of it is the infant of Queen Anne's. The coffin in the middle is Henry VIII, and the one on the right is Jane Seymour's. A marble slab with their names wasn't put in until 1837 during the reign of William IV, 290 years after Henry VIII's death. Henry never got his grand tomb, and most likely never will.